Have you ever heard of the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper? It's an important piece of early American feminist literature from the progressive era. And in this story, the protagonist is a woman, and she's basically pathologized by virtue of being female. And she is kind of confined to the domestic sphere. And the confinement slowly starts to erode at her faculties until finally she starts seeing things in the wallpaper that is her prison. But maybe you didn't know that the woman who wrote that, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, is actually a vegetarian feminist and one of what I would call one of our prototypical vegan feminists. So stick around and I'll explain who she is. So if you're new to the channel, hello, welcome. My name is Dr. Coreyleewrenn. I'm a vegan sociologist and a vegan feminist. And in this series, I've been exploring some of the big thinkers and influencers in the development of vegan feminist thought. So when we go back into the 1800s and early 1900s, although we don't have as many actual vegan feminists, some of them were, we do have quite a lot of vegetarian feminists who did recognize that there were intersections between the treatment of women, social construction of gender, and the treatment of animals and the social construction of animality and species. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman was one of those people. And she was very, very involved in the feminist movement, obviously, but she also was a socialist. And this really informs a lot of her work. So this idea with socialism, which was really, really popular in her era, because we have to keep in mind that the capitalist system had been problematized very early on by folks like Karl Marx, and there were other competing systems, and socialism was one of those. And the idea was that we could maybe arrange our society in a more equitable way that maximizes the capacity for human well-being and flourishing. And the capitalist system is antithetical to that. Because capitalism is based on the exploitation of labor and it requires inequality, and basically people are working longer and longer hours and being more and more productive, and all of this is in this pursuit of profit that goes to a select few of the people who own the means of production. So there were a lot of people in the progressive era who were pushing back against that and imagining alternate ways of organizing our society. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman had this idea that we could not just organize it to improve class relations, but also we would need to take an explicitly gendered approach to this, because she realized that, and Karl Marx, for instance, didn't write so much about the gendered experience, being a privileged man himself. But Charlotte Perkins Gilman, she recognized that women were experiencing a unique type of oppression under capitalism. And one of those was this burden of childcare and keeping the home and cooking. And so here's where we see an interesting intersection with non-human animals. So she had this idea that we would socialize a lot of things to make them more communal, to where it wouldn't be the individual woman's responsibility to upkeep the home, to raise the children, to cook. She, for instance, argued that we should have communal kitchens. While she was a vegetarian and she was an animal rights activist, she was also a bit of a pragmatist, if you will, in not actually thinking that we would have a vegan system in practice, I think. This is my interpretation of her. Because actually she envisions the outsourcing of slaughter, for instance. So she doesn't say that we'll not have a world of slaughter. She says we'll outsource the food production. And one of the reasons why was because of her compassion, not for animals, but for the women who were traditionally expected to do that killing. For instance, she says women would no longer have to call, "Hey, dilly dilly," for the little goose to come up to you, and then have to wring their neck and put them in the pot. So although she was a vegetarian and an animal rights activist, a lot of her activism for social reorganization and restructuring actually had a lot to do with rationalizing the food system and relieving the burden from women, not necessarily helping out animals. So she's not really envisioning a vegetarian food system in that way. Now that said, when you look at her utopian writing, so she's very famous for the Yellow Wallpaper, which problematizes the domestication of women, basically, and the ostracization of them into private domestic spheres and away from public life and really human participation in human life. She also has written quite a lot in utopian feminism. So her book, Herland, for instance, imagines that what if we did live in a utopian society where feminist principles were put into practice? And in that book, she is a little bit more explicit about what happens to non-human animals. And so she envisions in this utopia that non-human animals would not be killed for food. So in order to outline this vegan utopia that she envisions, she has in the book outside people come to visit her land, and that allows for a cultural exchange. And through the dialogue, you can realize what their values are and what is different in this feminist society. And they do actually confront the politics of dairy. And so when this man comes to visit her land, he's asking like, well, where's the cows? And are you not using the cow for the milk? And then the feminist people of her land are saying, well, what are you doing with this milk? And he says, oh, we milk the cow and then we send it off to this factory where it's processed. And then the women ask, but what about the calf? And he says, yeah, well, there's a calf because the cow has to be pregnant to have the calf. And then they ask, well, are you saving some of this milk for the calf? And so they're basically trying to catch out some of the irrationalities of a human supremacist food system. So this is not a completely vegan utopia in this book. There are bits and bobs. So it's interesting that even in this early era, it was written over 100 years ago in 1915, there was Herland actually is representative of a lot of the imaginative thinking that progressive activists were engaging with at this time, that just because this is the way it's always been doesn't necessarily mean it's the most efficient or the most ethical. So Herland is an early piece of prototypical vegan feminist literature it's really worth a read. It's really fascinating to see that early imagination that we kind of presume that people back then did not have, when in fact, this was a time of great political and economic and social, cultural turmoil. And that which we take for granted to be the normal, natural, historic way of doing things actually was quite up in the air, very much so debated in that time. There were various political types of approaches and different types of economic systems. Of course, communism and socialism were taking off in many parts of the world after Marx's death. So it is interesting then to see this bit of evidence that there were people pushing for alternatives, and non-human animals were not necessarily left out of that. But again, I want to clarify that in Herland, although it is much more closer to vegan ideals, other parts of her writing, she still makes room for slaughter and dairy production, and it seems that she's a bit inconsistent there. In fact, she was also quite criticized by some of her vegetarian activist contemporaries. For instance, she had been criticized for not wanting to talk too much about the gory details of what happens to non-human animals. The idea that we use graphic pictures and stories about what happens to animals in order to mobilize people, that's not a modern idea. That's something that people have been doing since at least the 1800s. But Charlotte Perkins Gilman was not too keen to do that. So this might explain why in some of her writing she sells out animals quite a bit, because she's hoping to get the bigger picture in place and not focus so much on non-human animals who perhaps she thought would dissuade people from paying attention to the larger socialist message that she was pushing. Now, this is not to say that non-human animals don't play a role in her theory making, because they do. And another way that they surface is that she, like many other progressives of the era, trying to figure out, like, this is the birth of social science, and she was a social scientist, and she was trying to understand why was society the way it was. Was obviously she was concerned with this idea of equality and fairness, rationality. Is this the only way to organize society, and how does it reproduce? So, like many other progressives of the era, she actually did look to non-human animal societies in order to see, well, how else is it being done in the world, and what are the possibilities? Of course, part of that is like, well, what's supposedly natural for humans? What is our biological essentialist way of being as a community, as a society? In these early heady days of social science in its infancy, non-human animals were an important source of alternate knowledge, and like to step out in a somewhat objective way from the way humans are doing it, with all this history and context and power and inequalities that are kind of confusing things. So these early social scientists look to non-human animals to try to understand what is the essential socialness that is the human condition. So there you go, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She's really well known for the Yellow Wallpaper and her feminist writings, but actually she was interested in food justice. She was interested in animal rights and vegetarianism and feminist utopias that were very much so inclusive of non-human animals. And of course, when we're talking about the Yellow Wallpaper, which she's most well known for, we can also see themes of vegan feminism within that, because ultimately what's happening there is that she's comparing women's condition to that of fellow animals, in that she has no agency, no bodily autonomy, the protagonist of the story rather, and she's trapped by the confines of domesticity. And in many ways, yes, women are animalized. And so we can look to a lot of her work then, not just to understand what it was like for women or feminist ideas from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but also to see how these early intersections of species and gender were being formulated. So although she was not the radical vegan or vegetarian that we would hope her to be, she was nonetheless pushing these issues when a lot of other mainstream social scientists and feminist scholars weren't necessarily doing that. So your homework assignment is to go check out Herland. You can find it free as a PDF online and see for yourself how these intersections emerged in this early prototypical vegan feminist thought. And while you're at it, could you please subscribe to the channel to see more content like this and help to support the channel and for it to grow. And also it's a big help if you could hit like. That tells YouTube that vegan feminism is important and helps me to share it. And comment below, have you read any of her work? Or do you know of any other similar writers and activists from the era who were doing this feminist utopian stuff that included non-human animals?